Welcome to the Aspects of History podcast. We are a new magazine, website, YouTube channel, and podcast dedicated to history and historical fiction. On this podcast, you'll find interviews with best-selling and acclaimed historians and novelists talking about great events and people of history. Head over to our website where you'll find articles, interviews, book reviews, and short stories, and they're all absolutely free. We also have annual subscriptions to our magazine at the shockingly low price of $9.99 in both pounds and dollars, which of course you can gift to friends and family. Anyway, on with the podcast. Please do subscribe if you enjoy it and give us a great rating if you can. So Rob, you talked about the Indian Army and how partition was affected by it and how important it was socially and politically. What about the Indian Army militarily during the war against the Japanese?
The Raj-based, the army of 1939, which was a product of a Raj imperative, could not have gained the support of all the political parties and of Indians generally, had it not been for the fact that it was a new army. And it had proven itself. It was not just, I'm not just talking about the army being successful in civic terms. It was a dramatically successful army against the Japanese. And General Bill Slim wrote his memoirs in 1956, and he called it From Defeat to Victory. And in that title, he encapsulates the entire pendulum of events in the Far East at the time. And there was profound defeat, profound military defeat, but not profound political defeat. The Raj didn't fall as a consequence. Very, very large numbers of young Indians started to join up without much urging, actually. There weren't the large recruitment drives that were undertaken in parts of Africa, for instance. There are many, many examples of young Indians wanting to join the army for lots of reasons, but the army was being opened up to large numbers of new recruits, and there were long waiting lists, and that was quite an extraordinary experience. This was India coming together, and there are some very good journalists at the time publishing things about this new spirit of enterprise by Indians for India, not joining to defend the Raj, not joining to defend the past, but joining to protect the future and to create something new for themselves. And I think that was one of the profound discoveries I came across, speaking to Indians and reading a lot of the contemporary literature, a lot of newspaper articles, and some very good Indian writing from 1944-45, saying precisely that. We've forgotten it now, so I'm not saying it for the first time. It's not new in that sense, but it has been resurrected by me, and I think it's an important part of the debate about history. And it's important because it's really important to give Indians their voice. And this is one of the things that irritates me slightly, not just about this country. We're not very good at it here, but India has largely closed off the voice of the pre-1947 Indian army and the colonial experience, because they regard it as being precisely that, as a colonial history. There is a very widespread view in India that anything that happened before 1947 wasn't really Indian history, because it was a different India. It was an India with 35% Muslim population, that problem's now been exported largely to Pakistan, apart from Kashmir, of course. And of course, it was British. So it's a very easy excuse to make. And there is a particular brand of Hindu nationalist, very, very noisy in India, that actually presses that argument. I just don't believe it. I do not see that for one moment, because I don't believe the evidence is there. And history is much more nuanced, as I've described. And I think in this country, our experience of the Far East, because India was set adrift from the empire in 1947, although part of the Commonwealth, when we think about the war in the Far East, we've thought perhaps about the Burma Star Association, we've thought about the British veterans of the campaign, and as time has gone by, we've just forgotten actually that most of the 14th Army was Indian. It was an Indian war, and it was dramatically successful against the Japanese. I just make this point about the Japanese, really interesting. Whereas Bill Slim quite succinctly and accurately recognized that this was a transformation of the Indian, the British armies in the Far East. The army that did not transform itself was the Japanese. And it was really quite a shock to me. I've written a book about this before. And coming back to it again to understand why the Japanese really sat on their laurels in 1943 in Burma. They didn't really understand the British. They thought they did. They thought that 1942 was basically it. Motiguchi Renya, the commander of the Japanese 15th Army, which launched the invasion of India in 1944, regarded the British to be weaker than the Chinese. Well, the troops they'd come across hadn't been organized. They didn't believe in the same sort of martial virtues. The Japanese had this martial concept called Bushido, which is entirely alien to European and North American armies, which basically says that your honor as a human being is wrapped up in your, not just your obedience to the emperor and the army, but your willingness to die for the emperor and the army. And that concept is completely alien in the Christian, post-Christian world, because if you run out of ammunition on the battlefield and you're clearly overwhelmed by the enemy, there is no point committing suicide because suicide's a crime. The concept of harikari, seppuku, this whole idea of emperor worship through Bushido is entirely alien. The problem with the Japanese is they didn't interrogate what was happening in the British and the Indian armies in 1943-44. And when they invaded India in 1944 into Manipur and Assam, they did so on the basis of some very, very flawed assumptions. And by that time, the Indian army and the British army in the Far East had transformed themselves. And there's a big bit in the middle of the book, where I talk about the transformation of the army, how the army recruited, how the army trained, how it worked together, how it dealt with the problems of terrain and climate and the long lines of communication, how it dealt with issues of food, and also how it dealt with the tactical problems of fighting the Japanese in jungle. What were the solutions that they worked through and found? And the transformation was quite remarkable, but it was done in a belt and braces way. It was done because of the fact that large numbers of young Indian men joined up, and they were prepared to fight, and they were prepared to sacrifice their lives in this cause. And that's another thing that modern historians or people looking at this campaign need to consider. Why was it that young Indians were prepared to die for this cause? Well, the very simple answer is they were defending India. And I think that's the simplest answer to what can be quite a convoluted ideological discussion. I think we just should leave the ideology out of it. And that's quite a remarkable story in and of itself, the transformation of the Indian army. And I have to pay a debt of gratitude here to two of my colleagues who have done some amazing work in this field over the years, Professor Ray Callahan in the States and Professor Dan Marston, who's now also in the States, have both done an enormous amount of really good work to explain why it was that the Indian army was rebuilt. Dan Marston's book is called Phoenix from the Ashes, and both Dan and Ray have collaborated in a book on the transformation of the Indian army in 1945. And I think that's a really telling story. And yet when I talk to some of my other colleagues who are writing history, people like James Holland and John Buckley, it's very interesting to see the comparisons that exist between Northwest Europe and India. In Imphal and Kohima, the big battles in eastern India in 1944, the army that fought the Japanese was largely a new one. Young recruits who had only been in the army for less than a year, but had spent the last 11 months training, were now fighting the Japanese and making a very, very good call of it. And exactly the same thing happened to the British army and the Canadians to a lesser extent in Northwest Europe. The British army that fought through the 21st Army Group in Northwest Europe were young men. They were 16 when the war started, and they joined up in 1942 and 43. They trained throughout 1943, and they went into battle for the first time in 1944. It's quite extraordinary. The very successful armies that we saw in 1944 and 1945 in Europe were exactly the same, built on the same model. actually, as the armies that were successful in 1944 and 45 in the Far East. The very interesting question that raises in my mind is, well, what's the point of these professional armies that get defeated in the early few years of the war and then actually fail miserably thereafter? It's a very unfair point to make, because actually all the commanders of the armies, the successful armies in 44 and 45, were of course employed in senior positions in the early years of the war. They effectively learned very quickly. And we mustn't ever forget the point also, and this is really important to make, one of the reasons for the great success of the Indian and British armies against the Japanese was the economic mobilization of India.
So, Robert, that's a very interesting point. What was India like as a industrialized nation? Obviously, you have in America, which is heavily industrialized, that huge power. But what about India?
India was not a manufacturing base before the war. Most of its manufactured goods were made in either the United States or the United Kingdom. And that had to be transformed in 1943-44 in order to be able to sustain this massive army that was fighting the Japanese. And large numbers of airfields needed to be built. The industrial and economic effort that went into defeating the Japanese was absolutely massive. And there's some very good historians out there, Philip O'Brien and a number of others, repeatedly make this point, actually, and we mustn't forget it, that wars aren't won by good soldiers on their own. Wars are won by the mobilization of society. And James Holland's made this point in his War in the West and in other places, which is that actually the economic and industrial potential and material and personnel potential of the empire was enormous in 1939. And with a good wind, there was no reason to assume that the British and the Commonwealth sort of imperial allies wouldn't win against the Germans and against the Japanese. And I think he's right. The trick was to mobilize those resources in an efficient way to win the war whilst ensuring that you won the immediate battles. And that's the problem in the whole of the Second World War, about 1941, 42, and 43. How do you actually hold the Japanese and the Germans at bay whilst you are preparing your armies and your air forces and your navy and all the weapons of war to be successful in due course? In the Far East, the Japanese gave India and Britain the opportunity because they gave them time by not invading in 1943, not invading India in 1943, by not really doing anything in Burma in 1943. They allowed the Allies time to rearm and re-equip. And this is another general point that sort of really struck home in the writing of this book, Ollie, which is that the Japanese invaded in 1941 with a very good plan, and it was extremely well executed and dramatically successful. But I don't think a single drop of ink was spilled anywhere in Tokyo to describe how success would be made good and how it would continue into the future. No one actually sat down and said, right, once we've got Burma, this is how we're going to run it, this is how we're going to defend it, this is what we're going to do, this is what we're going to do to make sure that no one attacks it from India or whatever. No one, the problem with the militaristic society that Japan was burdened with was that it was occupied by a bunch of guys, all guys, who knew how to execute a lightning attack, but who weren't able then to do anything subsequent to that and run the country and so on and so forth. And that was the problem. I mean, it was a one-shot wonder. And I mean, I've heard people say, well, of course, from Midway onwards, which is early 1942, the Japanese had lost the war. Yes, I mean, you can say that with hindsight. And it's true that it was a significant turning point. In fact, I'd say Guadalcanal was a significant turning point. But actually, the war still had to be fought. And the Japanese, we can overdo this sense that the Japanese were brilliant fighters, brilliant jungle fighters, well organized, all the rest of it. The one thing, I mean, I've long moved away from that idea. They weren't at all. The one thing the Japanese were very good at was dying. And they died in very, very large numbers, in part, and many parts, because of the incompetence of their commanders. And that's another thing that sort of struck me actually quite strongly during the writing of this book.
The numbers are extraordinary that you laid out. I mean, it's almost 10 to 1. I'm probably getting that a little bit wrong, but it's...
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I just give you a couple of examples, not a lot of numbers, but in terms of ideas. I mentioned earlier this idea of Bushido. Well, the idea of the samurai, Bushido is the sort of semi-religious code that sits behind the samurai. If you're a samurai, you're a Japanese soldier. There's an idea that the only honorable way for a Japanese officer to fight the enemy is with a katana, a sword. So Japanese officers weren't allowed to go in with a rifle or a submachine gun or anything like that. They had to fight with a sword. There was no Japanese officer would ever conceive of going to battle without fighting with his sword. It's just complete nonsense. And there's stories, the huge number of stories of from 1944 of large massacres of Japanese troops. These weren't Japanese troops attacking in a banzai fashion. We've got the sort of comic book idea that the Japanese sort of lined up and they just attacked en masse because that's how they did it. No, even when they attacked in a subtle way, in bounds with, a platoon will attack with one section up and two sections behind with machine gun fire covering the advance. They would do all that. And they did that very, very well, but they still did it repeatedly, despite the fact that they were being defeated on the ground. Japanese officers were still fighting with swords, and effectively, you get to a point in many of these attacks where the Japanese soldiers just couldn't stop. They just kept on going, and whether that was because they wanted now to basically commit harikari in the face of British and Indian bullets, or because they were being encouraged to go and die because that's what the emperor wanted them, is unclear in most cases, although there's lots of really good evidence from commands that Japanese officers gave to their soldiers that their time was now to die. And there's one very famous case of General Tanaka in Arakan ordering his soldiers to die, and when they die, to continue the fight as their souls waft in the breeze, or words to that effect. They were to fight even when they were dead. Well, it's just pure nonsense, of course. And I sort of came to the conclusion a number of years ago that Japanese soldiers often just died because of the incompetence of their commanders. And I haven't moved from that view. If Japanese commanders were any better than they would have fought in a much more sophisticated way. And people like Mutaguchi Renya, quite a remarkable man in many respects, had a plan for his invasion of India. He stuck to it despite all going awry around him. And
he was the Japanese commander.
Yes, he commanded the 15th Army that invaded India in 1944. Very driven man. He was hated by his subordinate divisional commanders, General Sato and Yamauchi and Yanagida, who all hated him. But they all hated each other. I mean, Japanese command was a mess. It's an embarrassment, actually, in India and Burma in 1944 and 45. And it was their own fault. They didn't have strong command structures, and that's largely because they didn't have strong political control of the military. People weren't sacked. Basically, the generals were in charge of events and affairs back in Japan, and there were at least two very significant military tribes all vying with each other for army tribes, because the navy was quite different. And as a consequence, you have sometimes very good generals doing some bizarre things, but more often than not, bad generals fighting and just sacrificing the lives of the troops to no avail. There were some remarkable Japanese generals. General Yamashita, who secured Malaya in Singapore in 1942, was quite a remarkable man and quite a remarkable general. But he was of the wrong political stamp and actually played a pretty low key for much of the rest of the war. He's called back and ended up defending Philippines in 1944-45 and was ultimately executed for war crimes, which he would have known about. But a lot of the other generals were just not good enough. I mean, I'll give you one example. It's an example I talk about quite regularly, and I explained it in the book. When Mutaguchi drew up his plans to invade India, he was given very strict instructions that he was to go no further than Manipur. Kohima was a Naga village that sat on the road between Imphal and Dimapur in the Brahmaputra Valley, and that was to be seized as part of the invasion. But effectively, the invasion of India was to ensure that the Allies couldn't use Imphal or Manipur as a base to attack Burma in due course. But Mutaguchi, when he looked at the map and looked at the situation, he's a smart guy. He said to himself, actually, the most important strategic objective here is not Imphal, nor is it Kohima, it's Dimapur. If I can get to Dimapur, I will be able to throttle the snake. And that snake, of course, was feeding Lido, which is where the Americans were basing their hump airlift into China. And at a stroke, it would mean that the Allies could never reinvade Burma. It would probably stop the hump airlift into China, and it would threaten the Raj. Here we might even have Japanese troops in Bengal. I mean, what an extraordinary opportunity. But that was denied to him by his superior officer in Burma. When the operation was launched, he tried to get one of his divisional commanders, General Sato, of the 31st Division of Kohima, to continue on into Dimapur by sending at least a battalion down a place called the Bokhajan Track to the Brahmaputra Valley. Sato knew that he would do this. Sato hated Mutiguchi with a passion. Sato, too, was blind to the strategic opportunity presented by Dimapur, and he decided that he would stay at Kohima. He would get Mutaguchi into trouble, because when Mutaguchi privately told him to continue to send troops down to Dimapur, he sent a very public telegram back to Mutaguchi, copied to everyone, including right up the Japanese chain of command. And Mutaguchi was told in no uncertain terms to get back in his box. But Mutaguchi was right. Dimapur was the strategically sensible objective, and Sato was wrong. Sato was an intelligent man, but he was a bit of a bullheaded commander, and he hated Mutaguchi, so he's going to do whatever he could to bring Mutaguchi down. And actually, as a result of that, he took his division to defeat at Kohima, massive defeat, and most of them were sacrificed on the altar of his own hubris, his own arrogance, and his own unthinking view of the strategic opportunities available to the Japanese. And this is a thing that sort of strikes me about the Japanese right across the Pacific and the Far Eastern campaign. They didn't really have any strategic vision. They ended up just fighting because that's what they could do. They were fighters, and they would fight till they died, and they seemed to think there was some glory in it. So there really was a very significant clash of cultures here. And every time I come back to this question, I have to go back to the reality that Japan was intrinsically, deeply, systemically militaristic, and it had been since the restoration of the Meiji dynasty in the 1860s, 1867. And that, that coloring of Japanese culture, that conception of Japanese self was really, really important. Why did Japanese treat captured prisoners of war in the way they did? Why did the Japanese treat civilians in the countries they overran, despite claiming that this was going to be an Asia for the Asians, and despite quite a large number of these people supporting them? Why did they treat them so badly? It's because they had a very exceptional view of themselves, a martial view, very ethnically focused and racist view, and that was their undoing. The Japanese failed to create a greater Southeast Asia co-prosperity sphere because they did it in a top-down way. They enforced it, and everyone who, their view was that to be successful in this co-prosperity sphere, you needed to be effectively Japanese, and that's the fact of the matter. Is the other reason I wanted to do this is because, I mentioned this Eurocentricity of our views of the war. If you go to America and you're a student of war and you're looking at the Japanese, your focus is naturally drawn to the Pacific campaign. And yet it's very, very clear that although people think that the Far Eastern campaign was a British campaign. It wasn't. It's a very important campaign to consider, nevertheless, because the war was global. I've talked about the grand strategic imperative of keeping China in the war, and to be able to consider the Second World War without considering the Far East, without considering what we call the Burma campaign. The Far East theatre was effectively the Burma campaign, leaves a really, really very significant gap in our understanding of the war. And of course, in studying it, we realized just how important India was to this whole story. And without India, the Japanese could not have been defeated.
Well, we're running out of time, but it's a very important story, and it's been brilliantly told. I just wanted to finish with one last question, really, and this is really the British commander who took us through, who took the British and Indian armies through to victory in 1945 was Bill Slim. You've mentioned him before. But he's obviously one of only three World War II generals who are on Whitehall. He's a big name, but probably not as well known as he should be. Why was he? And I know you've argued that he's the greatest
greatest general,
ever, including Wellington and Marlborough in that. Why is that then? Why is he so good in comparison to his counterparts in fighting in Europe, and why is he the best ever?
Okay, well, very good.
And that's a big question, I know.
No, I'll try to be as brief as I can, but I'll start by answering a slightly different question, which is say, why has he been forgotten? Well, of course, he was, although he was commissioned as the Warwickshire Regiment at the start of the First World War, he then transferred in 1919 via a circuitous route to the Indian Army. So he was an Indian Army officer. So the first thing is that he wasn't known to the British public. He didn't fight in Europe during the Second World War. He wasn't in the press. People didn't know who he was. And the 14th Army was largely forgotten. It was largely forgotten at the time in 1944-45 in Europe, when frankly the key job was to defeat the Germans. So he was the forgotten general of this forgotten army. Why was he so good? Well, I'm very firmly of the view that without Bill Slim, the Allies would not have won the Far East. We just wouldn't have had the intellectual horsepower and military horsepower to do what was needed. He was able to galvanize all the things that were necessary to create a new 14th Army and to take it to success in 44 and 45. And that's very, very clear. He did it by largely, I would suggest by serendipity. Not only was he a great general, but actually he wasn't bothered by anyone. People weren't there breathing down his neck as people were breathing down Monty's neck in North Africa and Italy, and in Northwest Europe. He really had a free hand. It wasn't entirely free because although until 1944 his direct commander was George Gifford and then became Oliver Leese, the real plans for the defeat of the Japanese and in India and then the reconquest in 1945 were Slim's plans, and they were successfully adopted. There were a number of things that got in the way of this finely organized machine, not least of all the Chindits, which took fantastically useful resources away from Slim in early 1944 that he couldn't use to fight the Japanese in India. But that was a minor issue. Slim was able to understand what motivated soldiers. He understood what motivated Indian and African soldiers. We mustn't forget the Africans involved in Allied land forces in Southeast Asia. In 1945, there were 100,000 Britons in Allied land forces in Southeast Asia. There were 90,000 Africans. So basically the same number. And there's, again, this Eurocentric view about the Far East. Slim was the right man for the job. It was largely serendipity that he was there, that he survived, but he was able to work through a program, an intellectual program, a spiritual program, a material program for defeating the Japanese. And he had time in 1943 to sit down and say, okay, what do we need to do? How do we do it? And he did the basics right. He realized that in order to fight the Japanese, a soldier needed to be trained. need to be rested regularly, need to be given the right food and right equipment, led properly. None of this is rocket science, but actually the great man theory that I've described earlier sometimes gets in the way of just doing the basics properly and relying on logistics and organization and administration as the bedrock of your success. Slim understood that perfectly. He built a really good team around him who stayed with him for most of the war and reaped the benefits and success in 1945. Slim was also able to fight a really good defensive battle in Imphal and Kohima in 1944, and then fight a fabulously exciting and dramatic offensive battle in Burma that completely discombobulated the Japanese. He ran rings around the Japanese. There's 350,000 Japanese in Burma, 1945. They didn't know what hit them. And he was very, very good at the psychological dimension of warfare, understanding, trying to get in the mind of General Kimura, his adversary in 1945, and do what Kimura didn't expect. And he did that spectacularly. So he was a lucky general, but he was a good man, and he had the right ideas, and the men loved him. I mean, that's one of the most remarkable things. Very, very, I was a soldier for 20 years. You don't really love your generals. I mean, you put up with them. Well, Slim was a very different character. I haven't come across anyone who didn't like and respect him, want to talk to him. And there's some really, really good examples. I put them in the book. The book's divided into 4 parts. The start of the 3rd part, I used the memoirs of a young Gurkha officer called John Twells who described meeting Slim. You just need to read that to realize what a great man Slim was. Slim brought these young Indian soldiers from the Madras Regiment, the divisional infantry regiment at the time, Defense Battalion, into his confidence, told them the Japanese were going to launch an attack in a few months' time across the Chinman, and told them what would happen. And lo and behold, it came to pass. And that's quite remarkable. And the soldiers believed him. George MacDonald Fraser said something along the lines of, I interviewed him many years ago, he said something along the lines of, whatever Bill Slim said would happen, happened, and we believed him because of it. Well, that's a mark of a great general, just being able to talk to soldiers and bring them into your confidence. And he was excellent at doing that. He did it without any guile or subterfuge or nonsense. He had a very open personality. He wasn't your mate, but he accepted people for who they were. Very unusual man, very, very successful man, one of Britain's greatest general. So there we are.
Well, I'm not going to argue with you there, Robert. Right. Well, fantastic. Thank you very much. We're out of time. It's been really interesting. I've really enjoyed hearing all about this. It's a very important book because, as you've described the Indian Army, this isn't something that's known about either here or maybe not even in India either. So a very important story to be told. And you got a great piece for us in next month's issue of Aspects of History. So readers are very lucky there. But I'm just going to end it by thanking you, Robert. It was so interesting, and good luck with the book.
Thank you very much, Ollie. It has been really good chatting this through this afternoon with you. I wish everyone the best, and I hope you enjoy the book.
Well, now you can claim knowledge on the forgotten campaign in the Far East during the Second World War. Next up on the Aspects of History podcast is Anne O'Brien. The Sunday Times best-selling author discusses the Wars of the Roses, the women of the period, and historical fiction itself. Is it an important literary genre that introduces people to history, or is it just making stuff up? I'm going to give you a spoiler. It's not the latter. Thank you, and good night.